1, 2. It's okay? All right. Okay, so yes, we still have a full room, so the exponential decay of participants is not yet established, except I see my 2 PhD students talking to each other. This is bad. All right. So after the first lecture, you are now expert in replica and the physics-style computation, and now you know how to prove these results rigorously. So of course now I don't need to go in the detail, and I will just assume that I will just to, some function that you are trying to learn that depends on your data. Okay, the theta are the parameter, and the xi are the data. So I will use vectors that are in d dimensions, and there will be n of them, so that we are consistent with numbers. Okay? So for instance, the simplest model is probably the linear model, in which, given x, you multiply it by your parameter theta. And then that goes into your loss. And there are many popular choices of losses. The square loss, when you minimize the error between, between what you want and what you get. So it's 1 minus y times f. Or if y is plus or minus 1, this is the same as y minus f of x squared. It's really exactly the same. Cross entropy loss, and so on and so forth. Okay? And of course, you don't have to restrict yourself to linear models. You can use more complicated model. For example, your function could be a function applied to a matrix, applies to a function, applied to a matrix, blah, 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 until you finally hit your input vector. And then all your set of parameters are the sets of the ensemble of all these matrices. And we call them weights. And this is a neural network. Of course, this is a feed-forward neural network. Okay? Now, if you open a book on theoretical machine learning, and in fact a book on theoretical statistics, they will start by saying the following. Well, as Gerard said yesterday, the trouble is what you will be minimizing is empirical risk, which is the average of your loss over all the data that you have and the label that you have. The trouble is this is not what you really want to minimize. You would like to minimize this over all possible data in the world. So the fundamental problem that people are trying to solve in statistics is to try to quantify the difference. How different will be the error you do on your training sample with the one you get on the whole world? We have a fundamental theorem here. It's actually the center of statistics. It's called uniform convergence of the generalization error. And essentially what this is telling us is that we have high probability the generalization error, or if you want, the risk applied to the whole world or to unseen sample, minus the training error, which is what you are just minimizing, the empirical risk, is bounded by a quantity called the Rademacher complexity, which is a function of the kind of training model you are using. Okay? So f is the function class that contains all the functions that you are minimizing. So of course, if you are using linear model, this is a set of all linear functions. If you are using a 4-layer neural network, well, It's a set of all 4-layer neural network. And the Rademacher complexity is actually a very complicated quantity to compute, even though you can do it with the replica method, actually. And another classical result which is fundamental, and which was due originally in its first form to Vapnik and Chervenokis, is that the Rademacher complexity is bounded by a constant times the square root of this thing is called the VC dimension of the function class, divided by the number of samples.
This estimate is independent of the distribution of the data.
Yes. And that's the important thing. It's a uniform convergence. It's independent on two things. This is, at this point, this is true for all functions in my function class, so for all sets of weights. This is why it's a uniform bound. And two, this is true for all data. In fact, that's, when you go here, that depends on the data. When you go there, it doesn't even depend on the data. So, as Gerard would say yesterday, this is really a worst-case analysis. Okay? But this is still an amazing result. Because if you have a function class with a finite VC dimension, if this is a number, well, if you have enough data, this will go to 0, and this will go to 0, and these two will be close. Okay? Yes?
Does the C depend on delta as well, or is it
no, it exists a C. You can work it out if you want. But, actually, that's the typical kind of thing you find in statistical learning books. They really, really don't care about this constant. Right? And you have a lot of statements. It exists C, such that, and they don't care. And okay, this is amazing, and it's great, and this is telling us, essentially, that if we have enough data, we can learn. Okay, what's the problem with this? I mean, there is no problem, actually. I mean, many people are still working on improving this, trying to get tighter bounds, and so on and so forth. The trouble with this approach is that so far, these results are way too conservative. Okay? And they have to be because they are sort of worst case. And one of the problems we have with modern machine learning methods is that these bounds are basically never telling us anything useful, almost. Okay, that's a bit an overstatement. And things are working way better than what these things are telling us. And that's one of the central problems of theoretical statistics. Okay, still, these are amazing results. Okay, so physicists, we are not looking at all into these directions. And what I will do now is to tell you the physics story. And physicists don't like to work with arbitrary data in worst case. Physicists like models. Okay, the first thing we do in physics is to make models. We, you could say that in physics we only know to solve harmonic oscillators, and this is true. But you could also say that probabilists can only do Gaussian integrals. And there is some truth to this. We always use a crazy model to compute things. You know what this is? It is a spherical cow in vacuum, right? It's a very good model of a cow for a physicist. And, we tend to overdo this. And I love this cartoon from XKCD. But this is what we are trained to do, to make models. Okay, so naturally, when physicists started to work in this thing, they didn't want to work with arbitrary data. They started to make models of data. And of course, this model can be good or really bad, or they can be useful. They can be totally ridiculous, but that's what they did. And since I'm supposed to tell this story, I won't lie to you, this is what we're going to do. And so, oops. So what they came out with in the late 80s is a thing called the teacher-student framework. When you have a teacher who is showing the student how things work. Okay, and it was something that appeared to the base of math knowledge in this paper in the late 80s. So that's what I'm going to talk about. All right, so let's start with the simpler story. Linear regression. What was done in this direction. And I will follow the physics style. So it will be teacher-student. So here is a way you can create artificial data. I mean, it's a caricature of a real problem, but let's see what we can learn from it. All right, so I have m. Oh, sorry, I will use n. I will have n vector, that will be my data. They are in RD. And of course, the way I will create this vector is by using them totally randomly with each element IID. Right? That's what we all do. Now, I need to create labels corresponding to these vectors. If I want to have a model of supervised learning, I need to have data and labels. So the way you do this is by defining this thing called the teacher rule. So you just create a function, and when you apply this function to your data x, it gives you a label y. So here's a very simple choice. Sign of x times a set of weights, w star, which I can also choose randomly. Okay? So that's certainly the simplest teacher-student setting. And of course, you can make it much more complicated. And another thing that people were doing in physics already in the 80s was to use high-dimensional limit. So the number of data and the dimension were going to infinity with a fixed ratio.
N is M here?
N is M. There should not be any M, actually. If there is a M, it is N. And it's certainly because my daughter was annoying me when I was preparing the slide, obviously. All right, so there have been tons of work in that kind of setting. Of course, sometimes using much more complicated rules. And so, I mean, I'm trying to give you some review of the literature here. It's more name-dropping than anything else, really. And especially this model was studied to death by Manfred Hopper in the 90s. Now, you can appreciate the gap between what happened in the physics literature, that everything was solved in the 90s, and it took quite some time before we could render all these results rigorous. But now, basically, we have everything under control. And so we'll tell you a bit what happens in this problem. Okay? Now, these are our data, and I'm trying to learn them with a linear model, machine learning. So how good does it get? All right, again, as I said, I will not make any derivation. I will use the notation that we introduced, well, that we use in this paper, which appeared recently, when we try to essentially gather all these, like Hollywood is always doing this remake of the movie from the 90s, so we did the same. We took all these papers from the 90s and we made a 2020 remake, which means A, we proved the result, and two, we ask the kind of questions that people in the 2020s ask, and not the kind of question they were asking in the 95. But still, it's really important, to acknowledge what was done by this generation of physicists. All right, so these are the kind of results we could show. In this high-dimensional limit, when m and n are going to infinity, so n and d are going to infinity with fixed ratio, the generalization error is given by a function, which is 1 over pi I cos of m squared divided by q. And what are m squared and q? These are the replica parameters that we discussed 2 days ago. And they are obtained by minimizing a function, which I'm writing here. And I don't want to go into the detail, but think of it as a replica result that can be proved rigorously. Okay, for those who are interested by this, the proof was not done with interpolation. It was done with a fantastic techniques, Gordon minimax inequality that works for essentially all convex problems. Okay, so what can we learn? So it depends on your loss. So let's start with the simplest loss, L2 loss. So let's try to minimize the difference between x times a set of parameters, scalar product, and what I want, which is a label, squared. It should not be a norm here, actually. It's really a parenthesis. Sorry. Okay, so this is really the square difference between what your linear model is predicting and what the label should be. So let's try to think what is going on here. So we start by a cartoon. What to expect? Well, it all depends on the number of data and the dimension, obviously. Okay, since it's a square problem, the minimization is just, you can do it by ordinary least square. So whether or not you will find 0 error or not depends only on the ratio between n and d. So it's called alpha. If alpha is smaller than 1, well, there is a solution. In fact, there are many, many solutions. And so if we imagine the set of all possible solutions, it's big when alpha is small, and it shrinks. And at alpha equal exactly 1, I mean, if your set of data doesn't live in a weird subspace of RD, of course, then you have the last moment when you have a 0 solution. And when you have more data, what is going on is that probably your training error will not be 0. Okay? And if you want, this is the over-parameterized regime here, where you have less data than the dimension. Okay. So let's try ordinary least squared. That's the way you would solve this problem. So you can actually, what you should do is you take this matrix A here, and the matrix A is a matrix in which each line is one vector in your data set. So you group them in a big matrix, and then your loss is really just a big vector y that contains all the y for each sample, minus the matrix applied to your set of weights, theta. And you just need to minimize the square norm, the L2 norm. Okay, so it's computation we have all done billions of times. This can be written this way. If you try to minimize it, you take the extremum. It leads to the normal equation. That A transpose A times theta should be equal to A transpose times y. And then it depends, how to solve this is, it depends if you are at n larger than d. Sorry, it shouldn't be d here. This is an amalgamation of many slides. So there should be some consistency problem. So if n is larger than p, there is a unique solution. It's given by the index of A transpose A minus, okay, that's fine. If you are in the over-parameterized regime, there are many solutions. Okay, there's this big blob. You need to choose one. And the natural choice is to use what is called the least norm solution or the pseudo-inverse. So that sounds, usually people say, oh yeah, use the pseudo-inverse, it's okay. Yeah. It's fundamental to say it. This thing, between all the solutions that give 0 here, we'll choose the one with the lowest, smallest L2 norm. Okay, and if you miss this, I'm making the whole story. Okay, but this is what ordinary least square will do. So this means that if you do OLS, you are not picking up any of the solution. You are picking a very peculiar one, which is between all these solutions, the one with the smallest norm. Okay? So it's one example of a bias. And sometimes, when you write, oh, well, we are minimizing the empirical risk, and that's what we do. It's really important to ask, how do you minimize it? And it's not neutral. For instance, here, I minimized in such a way that I was choosing the least norm solution.
So here, the function is not a Morse function. You have
oh yeah, a function is certainly not Morse. Right? And then I'm going to claim that you can do interesting things even here. All right, so let's plot what is a generalization error for ordinary least square. And this is how it looks, function of alpha. Sorry, I should start here. So anyway, so it first decay, then you have this sort of divergence and peak exactly at 1, and then it decay again. The black line is called the Bayes result, which is the best generalization error that could possibly exist. So you see that this is not such a good method. There is a quite sizable gap with respect to the Bayes. And also there is this weird peak here. So it has, okay, so now everyone is speaking about such phenomenon. In fact, it is something that people see in neural network, and Levent talked about it yesterday, and there will be much more talk about it, and Mathieu Viard will discuss it again. But I think it's interesting to see that you can see this already in, in the simplest possible problem. So first of all, we need to realize something. Why does it peak like this? Well, it peaks because you have many solutions here, and many of them are terrible. In fact, I know one terrible one, which is this one, because in generalization it was giving me 1/2, so it was not beating a random guess. And of course, this solution was also existing here. It was also existing here, and it was also existing here. So if I would have picked up the solution, I would have, a generalization error that looked like that. But this is not what I did. The fact that I used ordinary least squared meant that when I was here, I was, a bit more clever. I'm not going to pick this solution. I'm going to pick this one because it has the smallest norm. And what we find is that making a bias to a low L2 norm solution seems to be good. And this is why you have this non-monotonous behavior here. By the way, all this was explained in 95 in the paper of Manfred Hopper. So it's quite impressive that we were already discussing
but that's
such
the
thing.
origin of Richard in 28.
All right,
He didn't
good.
have it doesn't make sense, but trying to understand that. This is why he tried to understand the Richard matrix.
So, I mean, not only this is, yeah, of course. So this is interesting, and you have to be careful here. Because, you will hear people say, oh, well, it's non-monotonous, so the bias variance picture is wrong. And this is dumb. It's not that the bias variance picture is wrong. It's that the way you interpret the bias variance picture is wrong. Because you think there is no, that, oh, yeah, here I have something which is a very simple function, and here it's over-parameterized. Yeah, it's over-parameterized, but be careful. You're not picking up any function. You picked, between all solutions, the one with the lowest L2 norm. So you have put a strong regularization on your problem. And what we seem to be not understanding in many problems is a kind of, in neural network, for some reason there is this almost self-implicit bias that seems to happen. We don't understand it, but there is one. So it's not that the bias variance picture is wrong. It's that we don't understand the kind of bias that our algorithm we use are putting into the algorithm.
So let me just
Okay? Yeah.
make sure I understand. So here you're saying we regularizing within L2 norm,
Yes.
and this gives this. I could have regularized something else, and I would get maybe a different curve.
Yes.
Do we know what regularization produces a double descent?
Here, I don't know. Good point.
Is there a way to choose a regularization that would have no?
Sure. Give me 5 minutes.
I see. Sorry.
All right. Yes. Well, I didn't even regularize. I said I used ordinary least squared.
No, but you pick the minimum norm. So
Agreed. So this is fine. You are good. Give me hold your thought. You might say no one on his right mind is using ordinary least squared. Of course, everyone will use gradient descent, right? You will use something like this. Well, my parameter is living in RD, so I will use a gradient descent, or if I'm a theoretician, I want to analyze things, I will use gradient flow, and I will try to iterate things with the gradient of the risk, and I will have my learning rate here, and so on and so forth. Maybe if I do gradient descent, who tells you that this thing is going to find the least norm solution? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. We don't know, right? There's all these solutions, all the sets at alpha smaller than 1, there's this whole set, what's going to happen? All right. So to understand what is going to happen, we need this very powerful theorem. It's called the representer theorem. And that tells us the following, that in a linear problem like this one, you can always write your minimizer as a linear combination of the data. So the first time I saw this, I was like, oh, wow, this is magic. Why is it so? The reason why this is true is absolutely trivial, so I'm going to prove it. Okay, the thing is that the data are living in RD. Theta is a vector in RD. So obviously, this thing is a combination of a vector which is in the span of the data, so it can be written as a linear combination of the data, plus a vector which is living in the null space, which is a space where all vectors are orthogonal to every data point. Okay, with alpha going, if alpha is larger than 1, and if your problem is well conditioned, of course there is no null space, but alpha smaller than 1, this is what you have. So you can always write that your set of parameters is a linear combination of the data plus a vector which is orthogonal to all data. Okay, and which is possibly 0 if there is no such thing. Now, why, when you see this, why do I discard the eta? Sorry, the n. I do because if you plug this in here, when you are doing your empirical risk minimization, you see that the only thing that you are doing is taking scalar product between your data and your vector. But the scalar product with this guy is 0. So you might as well not take it. Say this again? Yes, you still have to learn the beta x, the beta I. But it's a different parametrization. So now I will have a vector beta to optimize over width instead of a vector theta. Okay? But for instance, if I have 3 data points and I'm living in R 100, maybe this is more clever because then I optimize over 3 numbers. Okay? And by the way, this is the essence of kernel methods that I will discuss later on. Right? So we might as well use this. Okay, so this duality is really important, and that's the end of the proof. And it's used all over the place in machine learning. All right, so what I meant is, instead of writing things this way, but okay, my function is theta times x, and now I have to do gradient descent on theta, I can just work in the dual saying, oh, my function, what it is really doing is just sum over n data point, beta ij, so that's a coefficient, my data point j times a vector, and this is really what we're using here. Okay, so then you can do actually gradient descent on the betas instead, right? And whenever, and then depending on if n is large or d is large, you will use one or the other. All right, so there are 2 reasons I'm mentioning this, because we are going to use it when I will tell you what a kernel is. And also because it's actually, there is a good lesson to learn from this. All right, so remember that was our risk. And before, saying that we don't need this guy, we had to write this vector this way, okay? So in full generality, this is true. The vector is always a sum, a linear combination of the data point plus a perpendicular vector. Now the trick is, if you start with a vector like this and you do gradient descent, this guy will never be updated. Because whenever you take a scalar product, you will get the same result whatever this guy is. So this guy stays all the time. That means the following, that in alpha smaller than 1, you can do your gradient descent, and where you are arriving at the end, the solution that you choose, well, you will minimize the function in the space, and this guy will stay forever. So the norm of the solution you find will just be the norm of this guy at time 0. So there are 2 ways to avoid having a large norm. Well, you can use the representer theorem and saying that, well, I don't need this guy, and you start like this. And this is exactly what ordinary least square does. This is exactly equivalent to using the least norm solution. That's a way to derive the pseudo-inverse. But if you want to use gradient descent, well, everything depends on what you will choose as an initial condition. Okay? And there is no way to if you initialize randomly, there will be a part that will be perpendicular and you will keep it, and your generalization will be worse than the OLS. In fact, it can be as bad as this. Right? So what is the best initialization in this case? Using here, you initialize at 0. Okay, this guy at time 0 is a 0 vector. This one is not here, and all the betas are zeros. And then if you initialize at time 0 all your weights to 0, well, your gradient descent will takes you to the minimal L2 norm solution. Okay, so these are very simple things. I mean, there was a discussed in this paper by Andrew Saxe and Madhu Advani. But it tells you that already here, you know, we started with something that looks extremely simple, totally trivial, and already we have to think a bit what exactly our minimization thing is doing. Right?
Your function is in fact, it's like a foliation. In one direction, always the same.
Yes.
The function does not depend on this variable. And so,
yeah, but the generalization does, right? Once you want to generalize at the end, having a vector that has never seen the data and which has, you know, maybe a large norm is probably a bad thing. And in fact, the reason why you have a bad generalization if this guy is non-zero is that essentially it's like you have done optimization and you add a random vector to your weights. Obviously, it's not going to generalize well, right?
So if you had added an L2 norm,
thank you. That's great. That's a very good point. All right, so least norm solution is doing this, but of course, no one on his right mind will use L2 norm. People will use a regularized problem, which is called the ridge loss. And the ridge loss is saying what, you know, don't optimize only this, but a regularization here, which is lambda times the L2 norm, to try to avoid sets of weight with large L2 norm. Okay, this is the ridge loss, and it's probably most used technique in basic statistics. And so what happens if we use this? Well, if lambda is going to 0, not if lambda equal to 0. Okay? With lambda in the limit, lambda going to 0, this is giving back, obviously, the minimum L2 norm solution, right? Because if lambda is very small, how will you minimize this? Well, you try to put this to 0, but you can, and then you pick up the lowest one here. What is the effect of lambda? Here it is. You have this divergence when lambda equal to 0 that you have seen. And here you see what happens when you use a different value of lambda. So it's always good to regularize, except that here I'm doing it explicitly, so you're not surprised. Right? But before, if someone says, oh, I'm just minimizing, you never just minimize. It's always more subtle. So by the way, there is a magic value of lambda, which is 0.5808, 5708, which I think is giving this curve. And for some reason, for all alphas, this is the best, the one that gives the best generalization. And it completely kills, of course, this the double descent.
So it goes down enough?
Yeah, it's not monotonic. That is actually what we learned from Bayes variance, right? It's lambda equal to 0, well, you trust your model too much. Lambda really large, you don't trust it enough, and so there is a minimum between the two. So you need to optimize. And okay, for some reason, okay, that is only for the ridge loss, by the way. The best lambda is this one. Yes, Marina. Good point. So the line are from the replica/Gordon theory, and the point are from scikit-learn with 100 dimension 100. Yeah, I need to mention that. By the way, it's not because I do the computation at n and d going to infinity, but it's something that is completely out of our mind. If you do simulation with dimension 100, you don't see any difference, right? And we see it here. Yeah. Yeah. It's in there. Yes, please.
So all these guys are coming to the same
Aren't we learning? People ask me, oh, you should talk about deep learning. Ordinary least square is already really mysterious.
So they all all these guys that are all coming together with different values of lambda.
Yeah, at very large alpha.
Very large alpha, and they are of course strictly above the base of.
Yeah, they are not only above, but they don't have the good rate. Yeah. They decay as 1 over square root alpha, and base is 1 over alpha.
But they are, you can prove that they all come together. So there is
yes. Yes. if alpha is fixed, of course. All right, now let's try to do something a bit more complicated. That was just a L2 loss, regularized or not, and no one would, well, it's not true, but you know, if you want to do a classification problem, it might not be the best idea to do L2 loss. Because L2 loss, you try to solve a linear problem such that your function is telling you exactly 1, which is hard for a linear problem, right? I mean, you take a scalar product, and you are maybe happy if for positive sample, it tells you a positive number, and for negative sample, it tells you a negative number. So maybe you should try to do something more clever, and indeed, there are many losses that we given by people who work on this. The question is, which one should you use? Okay? So again, let's try to put ourselves back into this phase where you have many solutions. And let's try to see what we should do. Now, one way to interpret a linear model is that a linear model is trying to put a line to separate data which are plus here and minus here. Good. So what do you do if there are many such lines? Right? So this is the kind of situation where you have many zero-energy solutions because your data looks really linearly separable. And now, which line do you choose? Which is the same as asking which theta do you choose, right? Theta is a vector orthogonal for this line. So, okay, let's do a show of hand. Who would use that line? With this no. Thank you, it's appreciated. All right, anyone will not use this one? Okay, the natural one to use, I don't know what you think, is the one which is the further away here from all data points. Right? I mean, naturally, you would like to use something like this. And the reason why is that if there is a new data point here, come on, I mean, this guy is probably blue. And there is a new data point there, this guy is probably red. So you want to have your separatrix to be here. And now, if you put two lines that touch the data, the distance between the two is called the margin. Okay, if you have separable data, you can make this construction, and this is the margin. And intuitively, you expect that a large margin will give you good generalization property. Okay, it's called D. Now I realize D is a terrible name because I use it for the dimension. And okay, let's change subject. A little bit of a history anecdote.
You could put M like margin.
Yeah, but I used before. So maximizing the margin is what is done in support vector machine. So there is a funny anecdote about it. It was invented by Isabelle Guyon, and she said that she got the inspiration reading a paper by two physicists, Marc Mézard and Werner Krauss, who published a paper on the optimal margin algorithm called the mean over. And so she said, oh yeah, that sounds to be a good idea. And then she mixed this with kernel methods and invented, when she joined Baylab, she invented support vector machine. But I think it's very nice of her to acknowledge the inspiration from a physicist. All right, so this is what a support vector machine is. It's really find this line and try to maximize the margin, and then you have these funny names. Oh yes, so the fundamental result is that if you use the hinge loss, which is this loss, okay, the reason why people have invented this weird-looking hinge loss is because if you minimize the hinge loss, the margin is given by twice 2 divided by the L2 norm. So small L2 norm means large margin. Okay, and so that's a very efficient way to compute the max margin solution. And these guys which are touching exactly, the first one who touch the boundaries are called the support vector. So this is very easy to prove. If you want, you go through the slides. This is a proof. It's 5 lines, just geometry. It is very cute computation. All right, so what do you find if you use the max margin solution here? Now, you remember that my data were made such that y was equal to sine of w star x. With this particular choice of labels, there should always be a way to have a perfect linear separation. My data are always linearly separable. Okay? So the L2 loss is not clever enough to see this, but if you use more clever loss, it does. And voila what you find. Oops. This is the max margin solution. Already it's much better. Certainly better than the ridge at lambda equals 0. And you don't have any peak in this case.
But I'm lost now.
Why?
Because it looks like what you do in max margin is also minimizing the L2 norm. So it's...
No, I don't, right? Because here what I'm minimizing, what I'm trying to, because in max margin, aha. So let's look at the, the problem with the L2 norm is the following. If I do max margin, margin, I use this. So whenever my function is telling me something larger than 1, I'm happy. The cost is 0. What is the problem with L2 loss? The L2 loss is telling me, I really want you to tell me 1. Which is a bit too much. I'm OK if you just tell me positive if it's 1, and negative it is 1. And this is why L2 is not powerful enough. You cannot, it's not equivalent to linearly separable. So if you use any other loss that goes to 0 here, then you can actually find perfect separations if your data are linearly separable. Okay, and this is why L2 is usually not a good idea for classification problem. Okay, so it's good to have this loss that goes to 0. Okay. So max margin is good. Now, one thing which is important is that in many situations, you will actually be looking you will be actually finding max margin without even knowing it. And that's one other example of implicit regularization. There is this beautiful paper in 2006 by Rosset, Zhu, and Trevor Asti, who basically said the following. For almost any loss that looks reasonable, that is, a loss that looks like this, that is monotonous and goes to 0, look to the paper if you, for the correct assumptions, but this is what it means. So for logistic loss, max margin loss, exponential loss, when lambda is going to 0, you will find the max margin solution. Minimizing the logistic loss with a vanishing lambda will give you the max margin solution. So it's again one of these things, but if you don't know it, you think, oh, I'm just doing the logistic loss, and this thing finds something so good. Why is it? Haha. It's not just the logistic loss. Implicitly, or you didn't know it, but doing this gradient descent here gave you the max margin solution, which of course, I'm not saying it's the best one, but of course it's going to be good. And you have not put it yourself. Okay? And this is one example of implicit regularization. And of course, what we would really like to understand is what kind of implicit regularization there is in neural network, what it is minimizing. And of course, for neural network, we have no idea. It's certainly not the L2 norm. So let's try to, I want to show you a sample plot in 2D. This is what happens when you minimize the risk with a logistic loss. And you iterate gradient descent, and you see that this thing is going there slowly, and you seem to be doing a good separation and taking something that is roughly going slowly to the middle of the data. Now, if I use L2 loss in this case, this is what happens. And it stays here. Why does it stay here? Because it's so happy, because for this guy, it's exactly predicting 1. Or -1, right? And it's not going in the middle. So you don't have this effect of finding the max margin solution.
Is it L2 without regularization?
I think so, yeah. Yes. All right, so let's do one more plot here. So it's good, but it's still, you don't get the base optimal result. So can you get the base optimal result? With these losses? The answer is no, but you can get really, really close. So for instance, if you use logistic and you try to optimize over lambda, your lambda, you have to optimize it, and it's not the same at all alphas. You can get this curve here. So these are different lambdas, and this is in log-log. This one is base, and you get this one here, which is pretty close. In fact, Lenka refused to believe that they were different, so we had to work the numerical minimization to make sure that there was a gap, and there is a tiny gap.
Is there a good reason for a priori?
I mean,
if you can achieve
a priori, it's not obvious that you can achieve Bayes,
yeah, that's
right? So in this paper, what we did also is to cook up slightly, cheated loss, and for this loss, which we know to design, then you can, really achieve Bayes. But what is interesting still is that we don't achieve Bayes, but we achieve Bayes rate, right? We have this generalization that decays 1 over alpha. Now, if you remember what I told you about DC, VC dimension and Rademacher complexity and so on and so forth, this is the kind of bound they give you. So not only they are far off, but they have the wrong slope. It's 1/2, and this one is -1. Okay? So I think it's interesting. I think a lot to learn in sample models, and also I think it's interesting that we go very close to Bayes. So very briefly, I want to discuss another linear regression problem with data generated a bit differently to show you that this is not something out of the blue. So here we'll use another model for the data. We'll use a favorite model of statisticians, which is mixture of Gaussians. Okay, so my data are still in D dimensions, and they are created by a Gaussian, except the mean is here for the plus labels, here for the plus sample and here for the minus sample. Okay, and you probably don't see it, but this is very close to the BBP transition because it's a rank 1 perturb random matrix. Whatever. Okay, so if data are generated like this, again, you might ask, what do you find? So we know a lot. We can compute the Bayes optimal error. It was done in this series of papers. It's surprisingly recent. Frankly, I'm like, people have not, probably some people have looked at it before, but as far as I know, no. And these guys are good people, so I'm pretty sure they did their homework. So this is how the Bayes error looks. Nothing surprising. More data. Get something that is good. It's not going to 0 because, of course, they're at some point mixing. So, of course, for this sample, it's hard to know what to, the reason, even if you put your separatrix here, you're going to have some mistake here. But that's fine. Yeah. Ha! Last one?
So the normal way to choose the regulation parameter as a hyperparameter would be, to compare generalization and also.
Yes.
So and here you show that lambda equals to 0 is the best one.
Here, no. Actually, the best one is a finite lambda for generalization. So you would have to find it by cross validation. Well, trust me. Look at the picture closely on a computer, and you will see. But now I will show you that lambda equal to 0. It's well, you'll be surprised. Okay, so what happens if you now use one of these linear model with convex losses? Well, that's something we looked at recently. In fact, there was many papers looking at this problem in the last 2 years. The usual suspect, that also appears in the lecture by Alice. Also, the group around Trampolidis, who has done, they were the one who introduced Gordon minimax techniques into this problem. And we looked at it also with Pierre Francesco, and Lenka very recently. And again, okay, this is a generalization error. When M and Q are given by this equation, which are the minimum of a replica potential that can be proven, blah, 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 blah. You're expert now in replica, so I will not go into it. Let's plot. And let's see what happens. So again, yeah.
This replica is replica symmetric.
Yes, I mean, it's a convex loss.
So then there's a chance to have a proof non-replica.
Yeah, this is, I mean, Gordon is the Gordon minimax technique is really simple, really great, but it's really working because it's convex. All right, so what do you find? Okay, let's first start with ridge, and we find the same as before. Up and down, and we have this peak here, and when we regularize, it got better. Okay, nothing surprising. We could use hinge And then we had something interesting because we have this peak for non-regularized hinge. This peak is the moment where your data stop to be linearly separable. Okay, because here, at some point, if you have enough data, you will have some of them intertwined here, and there is no way to separate them. And so there is a sharp transition here. Physicists often call this a Gardner transition, but it's a separability transition, where data are not linearly separable. And what we find, and it's again something that will be discussed again a lot by Mathieu and maybe by Levent, that there is this kind of weird thing going on that looks like a double descent. It's not really a double descent because it doesn't go up, but it's certainly a spike for the non-linear, for the lambda going to 0 hinge. That means for the max margin solution. Right? The max margin solution has a spike exactly when data become linearly separable. Why? Because this is exactly the last moment where you cannot choose which separatrix you will use. You will get the last one, which that exists, and the same reason. Exactly, it's the moment of boom. And physicists call this jamming often also.
But now I'm
Why?
Because I thought Gardner was a transition between 1 RSD and 2 RSD. How are we talking about reflection?
So Elizabeth Gardner was an amazing scientist. And she dies too soon, unfortunately, but she has done few papers, and all of them become classic. So that's another one.
Same Gardner.
This is the same Elizabeth Gardner.
No, I understand. But
This is not the same transition. Yes. And of course, we call many things in her honor now. So but before the glassy people were trying to publicize the Gardner transition, that was what people called the Gardner transition for years. Pier Francesco, which one do you call the true Gardner transition? You're the one working on both. Yeah, I hate calling it jamming. I think it's anthropomorphic. It's like physicists trying to push something, but I mean, going to machine learning people say, "Oh, this is jamming." I say, "Come on, it's a linear problem. This exists since Gauss." Okay. Anyway, yeah, good point. Now, one thing that you may not have noticed, okay, so these are the points where you have this linear separability. So these are the points where you overparameterize. Now, one thing which is interesting is the fact that base is here. So there is a funny feature in this problem, that when lambda is going to infinity, mind you reach base optimal result, which was fun. I mean, I think it's, obviously it's a particularity of this problem, and it should not be this way, but it's a funny mathematical fact, and look it up in the paper if you want. Okay. So these were all linear problems. Now we are moving to, obviously not neural network, because this is too hard, but to, linear problem in disguised, and by this I mean kernel methods. All right, who is perfectly aware of what a kernel is, how it works, and why this is great, and the limitation? Yeah, I'm not surprised. Good, so this is going to be a bit useful, hopefully. All right, let's back to our representer theorem. I told you it was useful. Okay, so now this is now what's really becoming useful. By the way, if you open a book on kernel methods, if it is written by mathematicians, you will have to work a lot to go through the first 10 chapters before going to something that you think is useful for you. And I still recommend you do it because there are beautiful math behind it. It's amazing things with reproducible kernel Hilbert space. But of course, I will try to give you the shortcut. Okay? So remember that whenever we have something like this, it's smart to write your minimizer as a linear combination of the data. And it's better to learn these betas than to learn it might be better to learn these betas than the thetas themselves. All right? Now, one thing that I didn't say is that if you think that you are really doing, the function you are plugging into your classification is a function that, if this is your parameter, the way you are going to decide the new label is really by comparing the new vector with everyone you have in the training set. It's not obvious a priori, but this is a consequence of the representer theorem. So, you think you are doing some real learning, but if you do a linear model, it's really some kind of template matching. You are really doing this. You are really looking at everyone, And then, of course, you reweight it, but it's really like, it's almost like a one nearest neighbor method. You look at everyone and you look to which one you look the closest in terms of scalar product. Okay? So if you think about it, it's a bit disappointing. It doesn't sound like you have learned anything, right? You really have to look to everyone, and somehow, if you write it this way, you really have to remember every single point in your data set. So this was analyzed by a fantastic scientist called Jorge Borges in this masterpiece, Funes il Memorioso. So he was telling the story of Funes, who is a guy who, read the book, it's a short novella. The guy has an accident. At some point, he fell from a horse, and then he had the condition that he cannot forget anything. Okay? So not only was it difficult for him to understand that the generic term dog could embrace so many disparate individuals of diverse size and shapes, it bothered him that the dog seen in profile at 3:14 will be the same as the dog at 3:15. Because he has to remember all the things that he sees. So he had learned Latin, English, French, Portuguese, and Latin. I suspect he was not very capable of thought. And then he has the best definition I've ever seen of generalization error. To think is to forget a difference, to generalize, to abstract. But in the overly replete world of Funes, there was nothing but detail, almost continuous detail. It's really the essence of what learning should be. It should not be template matching, right? This is not what we do to identify a dog. We don't compare it with all the dogs that we had in memory. As long as you stay with linear models, this is really what you're doing. So. Anyway, since it's not bad, we can still do it. So let's continue template matching. And OK, let's try to compare to everyone in the data set. But if this is an idea that is worth exploring, why do you compare to everyone in the data set with a scalar product? If you want to compare how the new point look like every other point you have, maybe the similarity measure as the scalar product is not the good one. Right? And so this is what kernel methods are doing. They just say, fine, I will use the function of your data point in the data set and your new point. And if you are clever enough choosing a good function, obviously this is doing something good. And that's all it's doing. It's still template matching. It's still trying to interpolate between all your data. You just try to do it a bit more cleverly than doing a scalar product. Try to cook up a good function to do it. Right? And then, then it's not so hard.
In the sense of Borges, you're still not learning.
Yes. In the sense of Borges, you really need to have a neural network that is trying to learn features. Okay, so in the sense of Borges, lazy training, which is equivalent to kernel method, is doing the same thing as Funes il Memorioso was doing. Which is not nothing. Okay? But in the definition of Borges, it's not really learning. And who am I to argue with the master, right? And of course, if you write it this way, you still can write gradient descent. There is just no difficulty. You write gradient descent. It's the same one as the dual one in linear model. And it's still a linear model, actually. The only thing that you need to do is to compute this for this value of the kernel for every pair of points in your data set. So it's called the Gram matrix. And you start to see it's a bit annoying. Your data set is big. This is n times n matrix. There is a reason why this was popular in the 90s and early 2000s. Is because a big data set at the time meant 200 examples. Already when MNIST arrived, that was 60,000. Doing MNIST with this method is already annoying. You have to use small trick. It still fits on your computer. You cannot do ImageNet with this, obviously, because if you take 1 million sample and 1 million matrix, it's not going to be good. But never mind. It's still something interesting. And then the question is, what do you choose? Well, a popular choice is the Gaussian kernel, which is just exponential minus beta times the distance between the point. Actually, if you think 2 seconds, when beta is very, very large, you will be dominated by the nearest point, and then we'll give you something very similar to the one nearest neighbor algorithm. if beta is finite, and of course you try to find a good beta by cross-validation and so on and so forth, well, you will find some good separation. And this is going way beyond linear model. Of course, it's much better because you are really interpolating between all the points in a hopefully clever way. And this is what, this one is one of the favorite one in classical machine learning. But of course, we would like to have a magic kernel who's really clever. It would be great if we had a kernel that, if we take a blue car and an old car which is gray and black and white, when we plug them into the function will telling us how they are really the same thing, which is hard, of course. How do you do this? Okay, that was what people were trying to do, designed clever functions. And of course, now we had neural network that learned how to do this. And so one of the game these days is to try to, build kernels that possess the kind of symmetry that modern neural network have. So there was a beautiful paper by the INRIA team, the convolutional kernel networks, and they started to get good results with good old kernel methods. But they had a function that was really complicated, certainly not a Gaussian. It was a function that was sort of using a neural network that was pre-trained or something like this. And of course, these days, there are much better way to do this, especially following the nice theoretical development around the neural tangent kernel. So I will not speak about this because I think Mathieu will cover it. But I just want to mention that using these techniques, you can really pick up the symmetries that your neural network are learning and then transfer this into a kernel. And there is this nice paper by the group around Sanjeev Arora in Princeton, and they cheated a bit. Of course, you always have to cheat in this business, but they achieved really impressive results on CIFAR using just smart kernel. Okay? And of course, if you use a smart kernel, there is no problem. Machine learning is solved, right? And maybe this is what we will do one day. But,
machine learning is supposed to, in fact, learn the right kernel, if you want, on its own.
exactly. So the true learning is learning the kernel, right?
So you're saying here they are using separately a neural net.
Yeah, okay. I really would love to speak about neural tangent kernel, but okay, anyway. So what you do here is the following. You're essentially starting with a random. So you chat with very clever architecture, but you don't update your weights, right? But still, you are iterating of what any symmetries that your architecture have. And it's a very nice systematic way to construct kernels. But that will be for another time, and it's a fantastic topic, but we have to choose. And I still am doing well on time. So there will be more on this in Mathieu's lecture. And also, somehow, I'm arguing that it's a bit similar, there is some connection with the thing that Max Welling has been doing. In fact, interestingly, that guy here has been involved in these two sets of ideas, and so he could tell you more about it. And there are very interesting development here. Okay, anyway, let's go back to kernel. And we are going to try to move to a physics model that we can solve that says something about the error for kernels. So there is a completely different way to see kernel methods, and this is using Mercer's theorem. All right, what is Mercer's theorem telling us? It's basically saying, look, if your function here is positive defined, and don't ask me the definition, because most functions that you will think of will be, by the way, for a kernel. But you can design some that are not. What you are actually doing by computing a kernel applied to your vector S and your vector T can be seen as, this is looking a lot like an eigenvalue decomposition. This is an eigenvalue decomposition. It's just an infinite space. And what this theorem is telling you is that when you compute the kernel, this is equivalent as just computing a scalar product. But this phi are a projection of your x in a different space. So instead of thinking, oh, I just computed, I have this clever function of x, and I plug it here and plug it in, give me a number, this is entirely mathematically equivalent to saying that, no, x was mapped into a different space with large dimension, possibly infinite. Okay, you can write your vector this way, so it depends on these eigenvalues and these eigenvectors. And you are still just doing a linear model. But you don't do it in the original space, you do it in the projected space. And since this can be a large dimensional space, well, maybe it will work better. And so that's a very good way to think of kernels. What you are really doing is mapping to a different space. And if your kernel is good, hopefully what you really hope is that in this different space, the scalar product will now be a good measure. Yes?
But then what good means depends on the task you want to do.
Which one?
But depends on the task you want to do.
Definitely.
What is E1 of xi?
So if you have xi, well, it's a scalar product between. Okay, it's a space. It's a set of functions. I don't want to go into this. Right. The only thing that you need to remember is there is an implicit mapping. It's really like projecting x to another space.
Like if you create a kernel using a neural net, it's not going to be fully.
Oh, I'm saying that this exists. I'm not saying that it's easy to actually write the feature space. By the way, the feature space might not be unique, and there are a lot of just one example, which is a simple one. If you kernel a Gaussian kernel in one dimension, when you are computing this, with simple maths, it's really like, oh, actually, it's not xi minus xj. It's the scalar product between this vector and this vector, when this vector is just exponential minus x1 squared, 1, x squared, and so on and so forth. So in the machine learning parlance, this is equivalent to using a polynomial feature map, an infinite dimensional one, actually.
The vectors are not the Helmut polynomial?
You have many different ways to decompose it. But in 1D, you can do it this way. Of course, you have to be a bit more clever for to do it in full generality. That's just an example to show how it works, right? So you can always think kernel method as this way. You map into large dimension, and you do a scalar product. So they are just linear model in disguised. Just that you had a clever thing doing the job for you of mapping them into a space where you hope now your linear model will work better. Okay? So, saying it this way, if you write kernel method this way, and now you replace this k by the fact that it is just phi, scalar phi, you see that it's really the same as what we had before for a linear model. It's just not linear in the x, it's linear in the phi's. Okay? And if you remember, we had the representer theorem, but we can do it in a reverse way. If this is a linear model with the phi, this is a linear model with the phi. So it's really like what we had at the first slide. We are really just doing a linear model, taking a scalar product with a vector, which is itself in the same space as the phi. And it's a linear model. The trick is it's a linear model where now you might be in dimension that might be infinity. So it's, of course, easier to fit in large dimension. And if you don't believe it, let's make a plot. Right? If you try a linear model for that kind of two-dimensional point, it will not work. But if you map this in large dimension, maybe it will work. In fact, if you map it in 3 dimension, and I saw it here, obviously, in 3 dimension, there is a good here. Up. There is an hyperplane that separates perfectly. So if you think about it this way, since if you use a kernel which goes in infinite dimension, obviously there will be a good way to fit. Okay? So that's why kernels are so good. They can always fit if you're using a kernel that maps in infinite dimension. All right. Now it's time to speak about the elephant in the room. Right? We say that there are these 2 ways of thinking about them. Either I use the representer theorem, and it's really a combination of all points, or I'm really doing a linear model in infinite dimension. Okay, of course you don't want to do this, because you would have first to make the mapping of all x to phi, and you cannot do it because it goes into infinite dimension anyway, and you don't want to optimize over, So this is nice to know that is what it actually does, but you don't want to do this. So you want to do that. Yes, but as I told you, if you are using this representation, you have to compute the Gram matrix, which is evaluate the value of all the kernel for all pairs. So that was fine in the 80s or in the 90s, and but at some point it starts to be bad. And say that you have 1 million sample. Then you have a millions times a million, as we say in French, mille milliards. So you cannot even store it. And if you are using ordinary least squared, forget, you are not going to invert it. So what happened in the 2000 is that people stopped using kernel because they could not scale. There was no way to use this thing. Because just storing the matrix was impossible. Right? It's bad to have a matrix that's that goes like n squared. All right. And what do? Well, either we let kernel go away, or we try to be a bit smarter, but that part we cannot do. Okay? When n is large, we cannot do it this way. All right, let's come back here. We said this one we cannot do because it's, you don't want to do this mapping to infinite dimension. Okay, but maybe we should not map to infinity. We should do this approximatively. For instance, we can truncate the expansion. So we construct the mapping, and we just take the 101st element of the vector. Okay? So in your case of in the Gerard favorite expansion, then it would be, okay, you compute the Hermite polynomial, but you compute a finite number of them because life is too short. And then you have a model which is a linear model on which you can just apply anything you want. And now the complexity is back to n, the number of data points. Actually, back to d. So if you truncate with 5 dimensions, you have 5 numbers to optimize, it's fine. Of course, if you truncate, your infinite dimensional representation to 5 numbers, it's not going to be good. So you will want to have a very large number. And there was actually a better idea than truncating the expansion, which is to approximate the feature map by sampling. And so this is the story of random Fourier features, and it will connect some of the things that were discussed by Alice. All right, so these were introduced by Rex and Raimi in NeurIPS. Yeah, it was called NIPS at the time in 07. And what they say was the following. Well, I'm going to build a feature map. I know anyway that it will correspond to a kernel of some sort, and then we will see what kernel corresponds, but I'm going to build the feature map. And what they propose is to use this feature map. You start with your vector fx, you multiply by a random matrix f, then you take exponential of I. So you see it's actually essentially taking some random cosines and random sines of your vector, and you map x to phi. You do this for all data sets, and then you optimize with the phi instead of the x. Okay, so this is the feature map. You can really construct it. The only thing you need to have is all these random vectors. All right. So that's the feature map. To which kernel does this correspond? That's very easy to compute. Okay, so the kernel between xi and xj is the same as the scalar product between phi and phi j. And if you write what it is, it's given, because of this feature is given by this expression. And when d is going to infinity, this becomes the average over this random f. And if you look at this and you write it this way, you see that it's just the Fourier transform of the probability distribution over f. Okay, and especially if you take f, p of f as a Gaussian, if you have an infinite number of random features, this converges to the Gaussian kernel. So they wrote this paper, they used this, and they actually show that you don't need to have a billion features. With d equal 100 or 50, it was already going good result in approximating the kernel reasonably well. All right, and then they give other example of how you could do this. And this paper was really influential. In fact, it was so influential that in 2017, they got the Test of Time Award for this paper 10 years later. And so we already heard about such award by Levent. So I think 2 years after this, it was for SGD. Yeah, 18. Oh, 1 year after that was for SGD. Okay, so that was really a breakthrough when people started to save kernel methods. All right, now you're all knowledgeable about kernel. Let's try to think what was,
So wait.
Yeah, it's a good moment to pause. I don't have to.
So you just
Let me go one slide and then I stop, because that's important. Now, if you think what this is actually doing, it's taking my x, then I'm computing the product of this x with many random weights, that give me one number. Then another set of random weights give me another number, and so on and so forth. And then I'm doing a linear model. So random features is exactly as doing a two-layer neural net, except that these weights are random, and you don't update them, and you update only the second one. And what I just showed you is that if you make the intermediate layer really, really wide, this converges to a kernel. And that was a result known for forever, notably Neal, Williams, and of course Resch-Raimi. If you take a two-layer model and you make it infinitely wide, and you never update those guys, this corresponds to a kernel method. Okay? So there is a duality between using a neural network with a fixed set of random weights and kernel methods. Okay, and actually the story of neural tangent kernel is a generalization of this to much more interesting and deeper strategies. Okay, now I'm really done. Gérard.
So you showed us one particular random F.
Yes.
So when capital D, whatever D goes to infinity, it's like a Gaussian kernel.
Yes.
Okay. So why is that better than just truncating? You have to estimate the difference when you get. It's not only saying that it goes to.
Well, actually, a good point.
Can you measure how much you lose by?
Well, I mean, you have uniform convergence. You have a lot of theorems of the approximation, which is.
Enough to say that it's better than just truncating.
Well, it's certainly better when you actually try to get the general, in practice. Now, the comparison between the two, I'm not sure. And it's all data dependent. And people are still doing polynomial. I mean, like for instance, in NLP. Doing polynomial features is still super popular. So,
But is there also, that's why I'm asking about the qualitative understanding. Is there a way to decide to choose a different low for F?
Oh, well, but that depends on which kind of kernel you want, right? Yeah. If you want a Cauchy kernel, then you have to, and it's.
No, but I mean, if you don't know what you want, and you want to find.
If you don't know what you want, well, it's machine learning. You have to think hard and come out with an architecture. Here, it's think hard and come out with a kernel. Okay?
But you just want to make explicit connection to what Alice was saying?
Yes. So actually what Alice, well, I will do it later. Anyway, if this is clear for everyone? Yeah. With Fourier, I mean the Fourier, yeah. Yeah, that will be totally stupid. So, but the thing is that, and this is already what what was very often. I mean, sometimes for some problem and for some data set, they realized that using D100 was really, really good. And if you want to apply kernel method to something like MNIST, that will work much better and much faster than actually doing the kernel method, inverting the gram matrix.
So this is the same question. Can you quantitatively?
Yes, you have. I mean, this is a Gaussian convergence here. So so you have a lot of theorems with uniform convergence, and it's totally under control. I mean, it's a very simple process after all. All right. Yes.
So, do you think that you draw random weights for distribution of F, and you will get you can solve the problem?
I will get there.
So you solve the problem if you just take random weights because there is random F functions.
I'm not sure I understand
So
what you're
you
saying.
put on the slide that you on the
Can we take this offline? Because I want to finish and I need 10 minutes. Do we have 10 minutes, boss?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, anyway, these random networks will come back in style with neural tangent kernel. So the last thing I wanted to do is to say, okay, can we do a solvable model of machine learning physics style, with arbitrary, imaginary data and blah, 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 on which you can compute the training error and the generalization error. Okay, and the answer, it turns out that you can. And so this is what we did. So think about that kind of neural net. Never update the first weight. You update only the second one. And that was exactly what was discussed by Alice, except that she was using here the L2 loss. And that was, this is what is in the paper by Couillet et al. And also by Songmei and Montanari. All right, so this is what we did. Again, we have a teacher, so think that you have n vector xi in Rd. We have a label given by a function, possibly complicated. And now instead of trying to do statistical mechanics of what is going on when you are learning with a linear model, we ask what is going on when you are learning with this model. That is, first going through random weights, then you have a nonlinearity. For instance, it was like the Fourier, so the cos and the sines, and then learning only the second coefficient. Yes, and we did it for... yes, okay, yeah. All right, and the cost function is given by that. And this could be the logistic loss, the hinge loss, the square loss. So the square loss was already done by May, Montanari, and Couillet et al. So we worked hard to generalize this to more complicated loss. And we asked the question, what is the training error or the generalization error you get in such problem? Again, when the dimensions, the number of... P is the number of random projection. So the dimensions, the number of random projection, and the number of data points are all going to infinity with fixed ratio. So that starts to be a bit more interesting. Now, just to scare you, this is a replica solution. We have not quite managed to prove it, and but I'm pretty sure there is some hope, and we can probably simplify it. But anyway, there is a fixed point equation, and then you can write what the generalization error is and what the training error is. Okay? And if you work hard, you will realize, oops, sorry. So just for those who want to know, this is where the loss appears. This is where the function appears, somewhere in this integral. And f can be actually a bit more complicated than just a random IID matrix. We did it for essentially any, for a large set of matrices, and it only depends on the Stieltjes transform of F transpose. So it's a very generic solution. Just here, I mean, you know, this thing depends, the loss is up in here. This is, you know, it's connected to the Moreau envelope of the loss. Well, I really don't want to go through this, but, you know, we can discuss it offline.
This FF star, FF transpose has a spectrum that converges to something.
Yes, of course. It must have bonded spectrum, otherwise the thing blow up. And the loss has to be convex, yes. Yes. We can, yeah. Okay, so when we solve this equation, believe it or not, in the simplest case of L2 loss, we find back the same result that we are finding with these two papers, but now we can look to more complicated loss. All right, so to finish, let me show you how the generalization error looks here, and you know, there is some interesting phenomenon. So let's do a classification task. So again, the task was, you know, there was a mapping from x to y plus minus 1. Now we send x to our neural network to optimize the second layer, and that is what is going on. But here, what I'm showing you is not what happened when you have more data. This is what happened when I take larger and larger neural net. Okay, so it becomes over-parameterized on this size now. Okay? So that is a generalization error you get with L2. You still have this divergence as exactly 1, when the number of parameters is exactly the same as the number of data points. Then it goes back, and you have this double descent. Interestingly, if you do the logistic loss, well, you have something very similar, again at a different point. And what is this point? This is a linear separability for your neural network. And of course, if you are using something a bit more clever than square loss, it's not at 1, it's at a non-trivial number. Okay? So this is exactly at this moment that the training error goes to 0, and same for the square loss. So this is nice because, you know, it's a baby neural net, and so it's still certainly a bit deeper than what we have in the linear model. And of course, you find back the same kind of phenomenon. There is implicit regularization, because if you do gradient descent for logistic, you will find the max margin solution. In fact, this is the max margin solution, and so on and so forth. Again, if you compare it with what you get with data point with dimension 200, there is a perfect agreement. So even though the predictions are asymptotic, they are valid. Again, you can also compare what you get with Gaussian random matrix and with an exactly orthogonal random matrix like a Fourier. The orthogonal gives you better result because it converges much faster to the kernel. By the way, we don't have much rigorous proof on this. It's actually something on which we try to work. Yes? Yeah, you want to know if you use an exponent? I have no idea. We should look at it. I didn't look at it. Yeah, I mean, you probably have predictions there because it's a jamming point. But I don't know. You can look at it. Well, it's a convex problem. This thing was going sharp like this, apparently. Yeah. But let's look at it if you want. Okay, and so what is interesting also is that depending on the number of projections that you get, you have a different separability transition. And so this is a very nice plot. When you have n over d, so the number of points in the number of in the dimension of x's, it's p over n. So large P means you have more projection and you are more over-parameterized. And in fact, here when you over-parameterize, but you over-parameterize, but you are converging to the kernel, so it's not really bad in this sense. You see it gets really good, and then you have a non-trivial line that make a phase transition for perfect separability. And this corresponds to the point where you have this peak in the double descent. You can actually plot this line. It's very interesting. When n over d is going to 0, you find back 0.5, which is a result that we know rigorously from Cover. That also was discussed by Gardner, Elizabeth Gardner in '87. And similar phenomenon were discussed by Pragya Shur and Manuel Candes a few years ago.
But you said something, you understand why orthogonal is supposed to be better?
So that's interesting. So that's something that everyone is doing in practice. In fact, they don't even use random orthogonal. They use Fourier project because then you have FFT and matrix multiplication is n log n instead of. Now there is a thing that it's always better in practice to use a Fourier or orthogonal matrix than a random one.
But do you understand why?
Well, if I will shake my hand, I will tell you, well, of course, because you explore the phase space a bit better. But there are no results here. Okay, I'm done. Except I have one last thing. The final twist that makes the story interesting. All right, kernel, random projection, and lazy training as well. You will see how it's connected. Lazy training and neural tangent network are cool, but, okay? But, my brother told me that nothing you said before the word but is really important, so this is what really matters. They are not that great, okay? And they cannot be. Otherwise, Borges will be wrong, and we cannot be. And it's very easy to come out with example where this thing is terrible. At least if you don't have enough data. So this is my favorite example, and there is an open problem, if anyone was interesting. So here is the teacher, okay? There is you don't know what W is, it's the set of weight of the teacher, and you apply your many data point AI, these are random vectors, and the teacher is just taking scalar product, and then modulus is this guy is complex or absolute value, and giving you y. So this is a phase retrieval problem. Okay? Now, there is an interesting thing. How do you do machine learning here? Well, you have giving me many AI and many y, so I will try to cook up something. So I could be doing what I just did now, using random projection or a kernel method. Right? So if you do this, what we find is that for any finite value of alpha, kernel method cannot beat a random guess. It's not only bad, it's worse than anything.
You need alpha like log n?
I have no clue. Open problem. How many do I need? Is it d square? Should n scale like d square? Should it be exponential in the dimension? Should it be log d? I don't know, and I would really love to find out. But you need much more data to get something. Okay? So we don't write this in this paper, but this is a consequence of some of the results we discussed here. And in fact, it's a consequence of something called the Gaussian equivalent theorem, which is a fundamental property that will be discussed by Sebastian Gold, who is here. And basically, this is saying that all these things in this linear regime, they really cannot learn complicated functions. You really need much more data. Now you may say, well, this is a hard problem, right? No. Because you can use a neural net instead. Now, if you use a neural net, and you try to have the neural net learning this rule, there is a very nice result by Stefano Lanka and Eric van den Eyden, who showed us that it exists a very large, wide neural net in which when you learn both coefficients, you give good result, or maybe perfect, I don't remember. You beat random guess. Yeah, I mean, basically you learn the rule at alpha equal 2. Okay? Oops, sorry. It was my backup slides. Okay? So, when you don't have, of course, kernels are good, and maybe you're in a situation where you have a lot of data, so fine, But this is not something I made up. This is not a crazy problem I invented. This is a problem that, Jonathan has to solve this. I'm working a lot with people doing computational optics and imaging, and they have to do this all the time. And believe me, they really, really, really like to solve phase retrieval problem. So if you go to this guy and say, well, machine learning is solved, it's all a kernel, you will not make them happy. Okay, so there is a nice connection with kernel. We start to understand them. It's connected to lazy learning, and this is all very nice. But feature learning is important, and it's very easy to come out with stories where learning the features is fundamental, and this is one.
So here the only difference is that you learn the reflex F.
Yes, and I think they used yeah. Of course, yeah. Yes.
So when it works for alpha equal 2 and alpha equal 3, you look at the F you're using. How different it is?
Well, you should ask one of the authors who is here. But let me give you a stupid example. If you use a ReLU.
Kind of learns the W direction,
Yeah.
right? Whereas if you just fix it random, it's never close enough to W because
You should have one set of neurons which learn plus this guy, and one set will learn minus this guy, and then you add them, and you have an absolute value. It's not so hard when you do with two neurons you should be able to do it. And actually, there are a lot of open problems here. We try to make this thing quantitative, and we are still a bit lost in the wood. And for instance, I really would love to know this. Okay, and you can even make a conjecture that, well, this is if we have a quadratic function, is d squared. And anyway, what I write here is true for any even functions here. They cannot be learned. All right, so I'm really done now. I'm apologizing for taking too much time. And thank you for your attention.